Let us pray. Oh God, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, you who are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, it was the summer of 1977. I was 9.5 years old. My Aunt Sherry took me to the classic Cine Capri Theater in Phoenix, Arizona. This 800-seat behemoth of a movie theater was originally built in 1960 in the Phoenix area, and our quest was to go to see the one and only movie that was showing at that theater at that time, Star Wars: A New Hope. It made, a huge impression on me and my 9-year-old self, such an epic story and an epic journey, and when we were driving home, I made sure that I was sitting in the back seat in between the driver's side and the passenger side so I could look out the cockpit of my X-Wing and I could fly us home like Luke Skywalker, right? Going through the Death Star and weaving in and out from Darth Vader and his stormtroopers and the trenches, and it was an amazing ride home as well. I don't know if you knew this, but George Lucas didn't even think it would be successful. So he did not attend the world premiere of the film. Instead, he went to Hawaii with his friend Steven Spielberg, and while they were there, they came up with an idea for a movie called, Raiders of the Lost Ark. I don't think it did that well. No, of course it did. And Star Wars was an incredible hit. And it spurred a multi-billion-dollar franchise. Even 45 years later, they're still turning out Star Wars content. And little did I know, when I got to the end of the film, to this part of that first film in 1977, this wasn't the end. This was actually the beginning. Welcome to the final installment of our 6-week summer series entitled Dreamer, the story of Joseph. And for 6 weeks, we've been journeying with a young man named Joseph who seems to find trouble every place that he turns, right? He was the 11th out of 12 sons born to Jacob. Jacob was the grandson of the great father Abraham. And, it was a combination of both self-aggrandizing dreams and being his father's favorite, which put Joseph at odds with his older brothers. Well, he was eventually shipped off to Egypt as a slave. The brothers let their father Jacob believe that his favorite son was killed by a wild animal. In the end, in Egypt, Joseph was convicted of a crime he didn't commit, and even after helping interpret dreams of fellow inmates, just got left and forgotten in jail for quite some time, until Pharaoh had a dream that was so distressing, nobody could interpret it. Someone remembered, oh yeah, there's this guy in jail that interprets dreams, you should go bring him out. And not only was he able to interpret Joseph's dream, or the Pharaoh's dream, but also to set up a plan for helping save Egypt, because the dreams entailed 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine. And so Joseph set up a system to make sure that the people there and those in the surrounding region would have enough food to survive the famine. Well, eventually Jacob's other sons, Joseph's older brothers, make it to Egypt because they don't have any food, and they find themselves standing before their brother, but they don't know it's their brother. And Joseph is able to give food for them to go home, but he also kind of toys with them, and 2 trips later, with a number of shenanigans, all 11 brothers have appeared before him. They thought it was a trap, but nothing had come of it to this far. So that's kind of catching you up to where we are. We're picking up in the book of Genesis, chapter 44, as we finish our story. Now, at the end of chapter 43, the brothers were able to finally relax and enjoy this gracious meal that their Egyptian host had laid out before them. Again, they have no idea it's their brother. And then we get to 44, and this is what happens, verses 1 to 5. Then Joseph commanded the steward of his house, "Fill the men sacks with food, as much as they can carry, and put each man's money in the top of his sack, and then put my cup, the silver cup, in the top sack of the youngest with his money for the grain." And the steward did as Joseph told him. As soon as the morning was light, the men were sent away with their donkeys. And when they had gone only a short distance from the city, Joseph said to his steward, okay, now go follow after the men. And when you overtake them, say to them, why have you returned evil for good? Why have you stolen my silver cup? Is it not from this that my Lord drinks? Does he not indeed use it for divination? You have done wrong in doing this. So the last time that the brothers had come to buy food, Joseph had also secretly returned their money with them as well, with their food on the way back, and nothing became of it. Now, they thought it might have been a trap, that they were being set up to be accused of having stolen the goods without paying for it, but really it was just a gesture of generosity by Joseph. But the Egyptian brother kicks it up a notch by having his steward now plant not just the money the second time they return, but also his silver divination cup in his younger brother Benjamin's sack. And of course, when the servant catches up to the brothers, he does what Joseph told him to do. And of course, they deny anything, right? Oh, no, not us. Verse 8 and 9. Look, the money that we found in the top of our sacks, we brought it back to you from the land of Canaan. Why then would we steal silver or gold from your Lord's house? Should it be found with any of your servants? Let him die. Moreover, the rest of us will become my Lord's slaves. Right? They are 100% confident that there are no thieves in their group, that they make this bold but reckless claim, right? If you find it, kill whoever has it, and the rest of us will be your servants. Verse 12. He searched, beginning with the eldest and ending with the youngest, and the cup was found in Benjamin's sack. At this, they tore their clothes, then each one loaded his donkey, and they returned to the city. Now, the brothers should have expected something was up, right? When the servants start searching from oldest to youngest in chronological birth order. And yet, when the cup is found in Benjamin's sack, they are crushed. But they do not abandon their youngest brother. In fact, even though he's the only one the servant wants to take back, all of them decide to go back with Benjamin. Verse 14. Judah and his brothers came to Joseph's house while he was still there, and they fell to the ground before him. Joseph said to them, "What deed is this that you have done? Do you not know that one such as I can practice divination?" So no longer do they simply bow down before Joseph, they fall on the ground before him. These are desperate men. They're begging for any bit of mercy that they might be able to receive from this Egyptian leader. And what's up with this divination cup anyway? Does that seem strange to you? Well, according to Kathleen O'Connor, divination was a practice of gaining knowledge from the gods or ancestors through various devices, right? Such as finding omens in the natural world, or reading the entrails of animals, or casting lots, or even receiving oracles from gifted persons, right? And divination was widely practiced in ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt. The Old Testament even mentions a number of these types of practices. And scholars believe that these types of cups that Joseph is referring to here were used to find the arrangements of small objects in liquid that showed the future. Kind of like how some today might talk about the reading of the tea leaves, right? But more importantly for our story, this cup literally becomes a means by which Joseph will divine the hearts of his brothers. Verse 16. And Judah said, "What then can we say to my Lord? What can we speak? How can we clear ourselves? God has found out the guilt of your servants. Here we are then, my Lord's slaves, both we and also the one in whose possession the cup has been found." Judah becomes now the key brother for the rest of this chapter. And could it be that it goes back to chapter 37? Judah was the one that suggested they sell him to Egypt in the first place. Whatever the reason, Judah begins a confession of years of guilt that has been festering in their hearts, and now it just comes flowing out like the release of a toxic stream. He pours out his heart before the Egyptian. It's the longest speech, not just in our series, but in the whole book of Genesis. And as it unfolds, Joseph, for the first time, begins to hear his story, but told with deeper understanding. Judah honestly talks about what this process has been like for the family from the first moment that they came to buy grain, the interactions that they've had together, what it was like going home without one of their own, knowing that they couldn't return unless they brought the youngest brother back with them. And when they eventually ran out of that emergency food supply, they reminded their father that they couldn't go back to get more unless he allowed Benjamin to go. Verse 27 to 29 of chapter 44. Then your servant, my father, said to us, you know that my wife bore me 2 sons. One left me, and I said, surely he has been torn to pieces, and I have never seen him since. If you take this one also from me, referring to Benjamin, and harm comes to him, you will bring down my gray hairs in sorrow to Sheol. And Joseph is suddenly confronted with what happened to him from his father's standpoint. Right? He never had a chance to hear how his dad reacted to him going missing, how hard he took the loss of his youngest, how his brothers never shared with him their part of the tragedy. He still thinks Joseph was torn apart by a wild beast. And decades later, he is still in mourning. So why do you think Joseph is still holding out on his brothers? He still hasn't told them who he really is. Some scholars say, it goes back to human nature. It's that revenge factor, right? That Joseph is trying to make his brothers suffer in some of the ways he's suffered, imprisoning them, falsely accusing them, threatening to let them starve if they didn't bring back Benjamin, and now making them look like thieves. And we may not want to think that a key biblical character has revenge as a motivation. But victims often need their suffering to be recognized, to be acknowledged, to be retold, so they can overcome their past hurts and move forward. But other scholars say, no, it wasn't revenge. It was a more calculated move by Joseph, that he was cleverly devising a way to discern whether or not his murderous brothers have actually changed, if their hearts are any different than they were decades before. And so he devised this test that recreated parallel cruelties that they had imposed upon him in their common past. And besides, if they hated him, his full brother, Benjamin, is the youngest. Maybe they feel the same way towards Benjamin now. Judah finishes his speech with deep compassion, and he begs the Egyptian not to force them to return without their youngest brother. Verse 33. Now therefore, please, let your servant remain as a slave to my Lord in place of the boy, and let the boy go back with his brothers. For how can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? I fear to see the suffering that would come upon my father. And I think it's at this moment that Joseph realized, you know what, at least one of my brothers have changed. Judah has definitely changed. He's recognized the deep suffering of his father. He's offered to stand in the place of his youngest brother, Benjamin. And that's how the chapter ends. Now, before we jump too quickly to chapter 45, I want to pause for a moment and consider one more thing. Kathleen O'Connor, in her commentary series, invites us to look ahead from this point in history to quite a few hundred years, maybe a few thousand years later, to what many people refer to as the single most important event in Israelite history, and that's the Babylonian exile. In 587 BC, the Babylonian superpowers invaded Israel and Judah, and they attacked and destroyed the capital of Jerusalem, including the temple. The temple, of course, was not just where they gathered for worship. That was the center of their life and their spirit. And eventually, the best and the brightest were carried away into captivity for 70 years in Babylon. 70 years. Eventually, they were released and allowed to come back home, but it had been 70 years. Think about how much can change in 7 years, let alone 70, right? What might Israel and Judah have gone through in those 7 decades that the exiles had been in captivity? And what about those lives that had been raised in a foreign land, new language, new culture, new cuisine, new customs, 7 decades? When it was time for them to return, could those former exiles live together with mutual respect and compassion with those that never left? Could they be one family again? Or would they be torn apart by past betrayals and cavalier jealousy and hatred? Many biblical scholars believe that the Joseph saga was originally written down at about the same time the exiles were returning home from Babylon. Of course, the stories existed for many, many centuries before that. They were told by word of mouth, but they didn't actually get written down until this time when the exiles were returning back. You might say it was the perfect timing for people to remember this particular story of Joseph, as this original Hebrew family was dealing with these same issues. Can a family that has lived apart for so long come back together once again with mutual respect and compassion? As we reach the end of chapter 44, the stage is set for new relationships to burst forth. Right? The truth of the past has been laid bare. The guilt of the brothers has been confessed. A father's love has been reiterated. And Judah's empathy for his brother and his father has been expressed so eloquently. What will happen next? Chapter 45, verse 1 and 2. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, "Send everyone away from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. Walter Brueggemann, in his interpretation commentary on Genesis, remarks, this right here, chapter 45, this is the culmination of the entire Joseph story. Everything that has taken place has led up to this chapter, and everything that comes after this is derivative. And until this moment, the brothers have been clueless about who this powerful Egyptian was that stood before him, even though he'd been dropping clues for the last couple chapters. But in the 2 years or so since they first appeared before him, Joseph has had the chance to sort of retell his own story to himself. And now he has a chance to retell it to his brothers. No more pushing down his own suffering and loss. It's time to come clean, overcome by emotion from his brother Judah's heartfelt speech. Joseph can no longer hold back, and the dam breaks loose, and liquid love flows freely from his eyes. Verse 3, Joseph said to his brothers, "I'm Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers couldn't answer him. So dismayed they were at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me." And they came closer, and he said, "I'm your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God has sent me before you to preserve life. For this famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are 5 more years in which there'll be neither plowing nor harvest. But God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on the earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it wasn't you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh and Lord of all his house and ruler over the land of Egypt." But a change has come over Joseph, right? It wasn't you who sent me here, but it was God, he said. He's been able to reinterpret the events of his life. He no longer sees himself as a victim. He can trace God's hand now. He may not have been able to see it before, but he can now. And God has turned the evil intentions that his brothers had into something good. Not just for him, but not just for them, but for all the people in that region. And because of this new perspective, Joseph's able to forgive his brothers. He instructs them to go back home and to tell their father, Jacob, that he's still alive, and then bring everybody, right? All of your spouses and your kids and your servants and all the animals. Bring everybody back. And he's going to allow them to settle in Egypt to ride out the famine. He'll provide for all of them. There's still 5 more years of the famine to go. Verse 14, and then Joseph fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, while Benjamin wept upon his neck. And then Joseph kissed all of his brothers, and he wept upon them. And after that, his brothers talked with him. As David W. Cotter puts it, then the scene breaks into mutual hugs and tears for the joy at seeing a long-lost brother and the sheer relief at no longer bearing the guilt of 20 years. In a very real sense, are they not all set free from slavery? So when Pharaoh finds out that these travelers are indeed Joseph's family, he gives his blessing to the plan that Joseph's already thought up. He even sends his brothers home with moving vans for the return trip. Verse 21. The sons of Israel did so. Joseph gave them wagons according to the instruction of Pharaoh, and he gave them provisions for the journey. To each one of them he gave a set of garments, but to Benjamin he gave 300 pieces of silver and 5 sets of garments. To his father he sent the following: 10 donkeys loaded with the good things of Egypt, 10 female donkeys loaded with grain, bread, and provisions for his father on the journey. And then he sent his brothers on their way. And as they were leaving him, he said, "Do not quarrel along the way." So a couple of things. One, new clothing. Remember in our series, anytime you see clothing, that means something significant is about to take place, right? And of course, Benjamin gets 5 sets of new clothing, 300 pieces of silver. You know, if dad can play favorites, so can Joseph, right? And I love the, and no fighting on the way home. Like, brothers are going to be brothers, right? And in this pivotal chapter in Joseph's saga, it ends with these verses, 25 to 28. So they went up out of Egypt and came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan. And they told him, "Joseph is still alive. He's even ruler over all the land of Egypt." And Jacob was stunned. He could not believe them. But when they told him all the words of Joseph that he had said to them, and when he saw the wagons that Joseph had sent to carry him, the spirit of their father Jacob revived. And Israel, that's Jacob's nickname, Israel said, "Enough. My son Joseph is still alive. I must go and see him before I die." Walter Brueggemann wrote in his commentary, "What other words does a father ever want to hear except, 'My son is alive'?" Right? In fact, one of Jesus' most powerful parables culminates with a fantastic celebration with a son who thought to be dead is found to be alive. And in reality, it's only by the grace of God that Joseph is alive after all of the craziness that he's been through, all the ups and downs. And you might even say, when it comes to the gospel, when you break it down to its basic core, it's the announcement that the dead one lives. Right? That was the message of Jesus. Abandoned by his brothers, the disciples, left for dead on the cross, was miraculously and powerfully found to be alive by the Holy Spirit on Easter Sunday. And here at the book of Genesis, right at the very ending, we find a precursor to the gospel message: the dead one lives. Joseph is alive, and not only his father, but his entire family rejoices in this miracle. Now, in the chapters that follow, 46, 47, 48, 49, all the details that Joseph set in motion starts to get played out, right? Jacob, I'll let you read it on your own. That'll be your homework for the week. Maybe when you're stuck home and the internet goes out because of the weather, then you can go read through the end of Genesis. But here's the Cliff Notes version. Jacob and family load up the truck and they move to where there are swimming pools and movie stars, right? Or the ancient Egyptian equivalent, I would imagine, where they all live happily ever after, at least throughout the duration of the famine. Jacob nears the end of his life, and he makes Joseph promise, nothing personal, but please don't bury me here in Egypt. Take me home to Canaan. That's where I want to be buried. And before he dies, he blesses Joseph's 2 children, Manasseh and Ephraim, and then he gives a blessing to all 12 of his sons, even indicating in the blessing that the Messiah won't come from his favorite, Joseph, but will come from the tribe of Judah. Maybe his confession had more to play in that, the way that Jesus comes into that family. Anyway, when Jacob finally passes, Joseph fulfills his promise, takes his father home to be buried, and then we get to the last half of chapter 50, beginning at verse 15. Realizing that their father was dead, Joseph's brothers said, "What if Joseph still bears a grudge against us and pays us back in full for all the wrong that we did him?" So they approached Joseph, saying, "Your father gave this instruction before he died. Say to Joseph, I beg you, forgive the crimes of your brothers and all the wrong that they did in harming you. Now therefore, please forgive the crimes of your servant, the servant of the God your father. Now let me remind you, years have passed since chapter 45. We just had the reunion, but years had passed. And yet it seems like the brothers still, they don't know if they can truly trust where Joseph's heart is on this. Has he truly forgiven them for their past sins? I mean, Dad's not here anymore. What's to say he doesn't just give us what we deserve? So they lie about some deathbed promise that their father made them, just to try to spare themselves from what might happen next. Now, if we were going to stop and ask you how to finish the story, what would you say Joseph's response should be at this moment? Verse 17, Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Then his brothers also wept and fell down before him and said, we are here as your slaves. But Joseph said to them, do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people as he is doing today. So have no fear. I myself will provide for you and your little ones. And in this way, Joseph reassured them, speaking kindly to them. I love how his first response is tears, right? I think tears of sadness, realizing that his brothers still weren't sure about his intentions toward them. And I think God probably shed similar tears when we fail to recognize the grace that God has extended over and over and over in our lives to each of us. The brothers were like, we will turn in our status as brothers to be servants, just don't kill us. And Joseph is like, I have so much more for you than that. Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good in order to preserve a numerous people as he is doing today. And there it is again. Grace, humility, spiritual maturity that's been forged out of life's hardest lessons. It's amazing grace, friends. And Joseph tells them in no uncertain terms, it's all forgiven. It's been forgiven. Can't you realize that grace abounds? God has turned what you intended for evil into something good. Some of you remember when I started the series, I said this verse from Romans 8:28 is going to be the refrain that we hear over and over again. We know that all things work together for good for those who love God and who are called according to God's purpose. And through it all, God has been working for good in Joseph's crazy life. At every step in the journey, when he was down in the bottom of that pit, to being sexually assaulted, to being thrown in jail for a crime he didn't commit, to being forgotten by those that he helped, all the way up to being elevated in Pharaoh's court, God caused good to come out of the evil and the harm that others intended for him. And Joseph, as he has matured, was able to expand and enlarge his view of things. And he knew, or he soon learned, that God's plans and purposes ran far deeper and richer than he could ever dream. And boy, could that kid dream, right? But in the end, at the end of Genesis, it's not really the end at all. In fact, it's just the beginning. It's the beginning of the next chapter of God's people. In fact, in between chapter 50, when you flip the page to Exodus chapter 1, 400 years pass in that page flip. 400 years, and the story will indeed take a dark turn for God's people. So dark, in fact, that some will lose hope, and that's when a baby by the name of Moses is born and another epic story begins. You might say, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away from George Lucas's epic story, right? So, as we've come to the end, I have to ask, how has God used this story to speak to you? Is it maybe a word of hope in your own life? A challenge to reconciliation? Maybe it's an opportunity to take a bigger view of the events of your life, and looking back, maybe you can see somehow God's hand now where you couldn't see it before. Or maybe there's someone who, shall we just say, has been a little bit annoying in your life. Maybe you just need to give them a little bit of room to grow and mature like Joseph did. Whatever it is, may you begin to see the power of the gospel in Joseph's story and in your own life as well. And may you come to embrace the incredible love and grace that God has for you and for your family. And all God's people said, Amen. Amen. Amen.